expected exactly what would happen. But anyone who's been paying close attention understands that there are many signals that something was in the air. First, there are several popular uprisings that have taken place in the last 10 years, not just in the Arab world, but also in Iran and other places as well, because they all share a common problem, which is a neoliberal capitalist system that thins out the middle, polarizes the population, and increases poverty. And so there have been 3,000 strikes in Egypt in the last 10 years or so. There have been organizations that have been set up to expose government violence against the people, human rights organizations, and so on and so forth. And everybody was waiting to see what would happen when Mubarak either dies or resigns, because he is an old man. And the issue of transition from Mubarak to something else has been an issue of discussion among intellectuals and policymakers for at least 3-4 years. And we understand from WikiLeaks that the United States government and Israel have held broad discussions on the transition from Mubarak. And this is how Omar Suleiman's name and Tantawi's name came up. One came up as the hatchman and the other one came up as the poodle. These are the words that were used. So Omar Suleiman was the enforcer, head of the spy master. He was the person who was seen as the strongest ally of Israel, the strongest stand against Iran, the strongest pro-US sentiment, and he was the favored successor. Tantawi, who was head of the military, was considered someone who is a puppet of Mubarak. And here we are. The only person that they did not consider was, of course, the Egyptian people themselves as the main actors in this drama. And the Egyptian people have ruined the calculations of all the policymakers. And they, I'm sure, will continue to undermine our own calculations, because this is a bottom-up movement, not one that is led by a few elite. So we all expected something will happen in Egypt when Mubarak leaves, but I don't think anybody expected a popular revolution would force him to go before he was ready. I think what we will see in Egypt is a slight repetition of what we saw in Tunis, which is to say that overthrowing the dictator is the beginning of a process. And this process will go up and down like a roller coaster. In the beginning, in Tunisia, the government thought that by getting rid of Ben Ali, sacrificing one of their own, they can maintain the system, and they appointed a government in which the old regime figures had all the key positions. This was not acceptable to the people, who continued with their demonstrations until they started shifting the makeup of the cabinet. I think we will see the same thing happen in Egypt, maybe even faster. So the military is in a very difficult position. They have been, ever since really the Camp David Accords with the United States and Israel, been told, here is some money, go and play, don't forget about war with Israel, start your own companies and enjoy yourselves, and stay in the barracks. And in fact, the Egyptian military has done exactly that, with 10 to 15% of the Egyptian economy doing everything from appliances to electrical equipment, etc. And they have not been in the business of direct governance really since the 70s. And now it is a big question of whether the pressure on them from the United States, from Israel, from Saudi Arabia, and from other regimes will be so great as to force them to stay in power because everybody's afraid of a bottom-up revolution, or will they try to go back to a comfortable situation as soon as possible by handing over to a civilian government as soon as possible. Until now, they have walked a very fine and tight rope. They have accepted certain demands. They dissolved the two houses of parliament. They suspended the constitution. They've met with some opposition leaders. They've released many statements saying that they understand and appreciate what the revolution has done. At the same time, they have not lifted the emergency laws yet. At the same time, they have kept the government that Mubarak appointed in place so far. and they are telling people to go back home, and they are telling the strikers to stop striking. What we see now is a movement which was very broad based in terms of class, but which a prominent role was played by the young and the educated in terms of organizing, has been given muscle by a working class and a bureaucracy coming out to join in a very big way. This explains the swelling of the ranks. And these actions, such as strikes by civil servants or by factory workers, will not stop simply because Mubarak is gone. Because for them, what they are really concerned with are the little Mubaraks, the ones in control of the factories, the one in control of the television station, the ones who Mubarak reproduced according to his own system. As long as this infrastructure of governance is still in place, the vast majority of people who have really social demands, not just political demands, will not stop. And the military will have to decide whether it's going to confront them or it's going to try to stay ahead of the big wave and make a transition as quickly as possible. That's my crystal ball. Yes, I'll be happy to discuss each country specifically, but let's just remember, first of all, this is a crisis of capitalism, and many of the same neoliberal policies that were applied in Egypt and elsewhere are causing, are creating the circumstances in which people find themselves forced to go against very brutal and repressive regimes because they have lost their dignity and they want to regain it. So in the case of, and so this is not just an Arab phenomenon, even though Al Jazeera and other stations have been at the forefront of covering it, in many ways are part of making it an Arab phenomenon as well. So we must distinguish between Arab countries that have oil and small populations and all the rest of the Arab countries. The ones with large populations and with little or no oil are the most likely candidates for continuous revolts. So Algeria has some oil, but it also has a very large and poor population, and there's been tremendous desire for change ever since the elections. What was it? 1981.
No,
no,
1991. The elections that were stolen.
Yes, ever since the elections of 1991, which seemed to favor the Islamic forces in Algeria, FIS, were stopped by a military coup, and this then went into a civil war, and the military has been extremely brutal in how it dealt with the population. The demonstrations there will not stop. They are insisting on having weekly demonstrations. We saw the first one fizzle out largely because the government, learning from Egypt, brought in over 30,000 policemen, much larger than the demonstration itself, and they arrested about 300 members, including many of the leaders. Another country which has had a very intense and unsettled situation for many, many years is Yemen. There's been a civil war, an uprising in the south, a lot of dissatisfaction in the north. The U.S. government has been involved very much in counter-terrorism activities there. Ali Abdullah Saleh, the leader of Yemen, just before the Tunisian uprising, made a constitutional amendment which would allow him to stay leader for life. Right after the Tunisian uprising, he voluntarily gave up that position, and he is paying very close attention. We know this because he noticed how the Egyptian people took over the most important and symbolic square of Cairo for their demonstrations. So on February 3rd, he sent his own pro-government people to the main square in Sana'a, which they occupied, and they put up tents, and they have daily demonstrations now in favor of Saleh. Nevertheless, there's been major clashes, and the grievances there are long, and they will continue. We see in many countries voluntarily dissolving their governments, shaking them up in the hope that some cosmetic changes will be accepted. We see the Palestinian Authority just yesterday dissolving its cabinet. We saw the one in Jordan a couple of weeks ago. In Iraq, the government took on a number of measures such as raising wages and paying parts of electricity bills and so on. In Syria, they did the same. In Bahrain and others, Kuwait, they've given cash lump sums of money to the population. These are all indications that these regimes are not based on any solid foundations or legitimacy. They are very internally weak. They would depend on a repressive apparatus to stay in power with support from the United States, and they see now that their apparatus lives on fear, and if the cycle of fear is broken, then they are in trouble. They see now that there are limits to US power, and they see now that the structural conditions that have caused these uprisings cannot be resolved very quickly. So they are looking at whether they can survive the next few months or years, and this means that there's a major turning point in the region. Syria, there's no doubt there's a great desire for democratic change in Syria, but Syria is one of those countries which operates on two levels simultaneously. There is the official level, and there's the unofficial level. So on the one hand, the Syrian government has laws on the books about economic control of the about whether the internet can be used and which sites and so on and so forth. On the other hand, they allow a very dynamic economic exchange under these rules, and they also allow people to reach the destinations they want on the internet through proxy. They don't try to stop them. And the Syrian government has been very, very smart in terms of how it tried to distribute the goodies in the country. So they've invested heavily in the countryside since the 1970s in the rural areas, unlike many other countries. They've allowed the merchant classes, especially in Damascus and Aleppo, to flourish and spread their wings. And in fact, there's an alliance between them and the government. They have left Lebanon for the most part, and they've managed to ally themselves strategically on the other side of the United States in many instances, which meant that this disillusionment with the government was never translated necessarily or made a organic connection with disillusionment with U.S. foreign policy and Israeli policies. This doesn't mean that change is not coming to Syria. It just means that it's a much more open place than it looks like to people on both economic and political levels, and it has a leadership that's been able to absorb social discontent very effectively. But it is a military dictatorship, like many other places, and it is the same age as all the other places. So we can think of the '67 war as the moment in which the current regimes that exist in the Arab world came into place and were ossified and stayed in that position until now. So Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, acceded really after 66, 67, formalized in 1970 and passed it on to his son. Colonel Gaddafi came in 68 and now is prepping up son Saif al-Dawla. You have, of course, Gamal Abdel Nasser died in 1970, and then followed by Sadat and Mubarak in the same kind of regime. And you see this basically all along, up and down the Arab world. This configuration of the post-1967 configuration has been being eroded from the inside for a very long time now, and what we see is finally at the moment when it starts to fall apart. Well,
is he better suited than the others, or?
Colonel Gaddafi has always been an unpredictable figure, except in one thing. There's only been one consistent thing in him remaining in power. But otherwise, he's spanned the ideological gamut from the Jamahiriya of initially socialist and Arab nationalist politics to Islamic politics to now today, I think, joining the demonstration against his own government. There's a demonstration in Libya against corruption, and he's joining it. He also has this from father to son issue going. So there's a reason why they all are in the same pattern, and that's because none of these governments really have stepped beyond the boundaries of the colonial relationship that existed in the past. Mm-hmm. And so the national rebellion, which invested legitimacy and sovereignty in the state as a way of saying we are now an independent state away from the colonial period, is now being translated into a social movement which invests legitimacy and power and sovereignty in the people. And so these states, regardless of their political positions and some of their economic policies, have maintained in many ways the same structures as existed under colonialism, which answered the national question but not the social question. And so now the social question is exploding everywhere. That's what gives energy and power to these demonstrations. And so this is the moment really of the promise of the first part of the 20th century, of a post-empire region which will have independence, sovereignty, and prosperity. They've had to wait 100 years, and this is now the beginning of the end of that colonial legacy. Right. They also differ among themselves significantly. So a liminal case is that of Bahrain, because in Bahrain you have a situation where there's a government in charge that is systematically discriminating against the majority of its citizens because they are Shiites, and pursuing a number of very humiliating policies vis-a-vis the population. They cannot get government jobs. They cannot get any important positions in the ruling structure. The government is bringing in Sunni Muslims from other places and giving them citizenship so they can change the demographic composition. And there's been a very strong grassroots movement for social justice and democracy in Bahrain that is the oldest, perhaps, in the Gulf region. And so that is a place that will continuously reflect the real contradictions. In the case of the other Gulf countries that still have small populations and large resources, they are situated differently in this capitalist order. They are enjoying the top position in that capitalist order, and their main concern is how to translate oil capital into cultural capital by becoming important players on the international scene, whether it's the sports franchise going to Qatar or whether it's the new museums being set up in Abu Dhabi and Dubai and so on and so forth. Saudi Arabia is a giant of these countries. Its population has increased tremendously. Its oil reserves are also still very large. But it is one that has vied for leadership of the Arab world with Egypt during the Arab nationalist period. And as a result of Israel's victory over Egypt in 1967, Saudi Arabia, by proxy, sort of won that struggle with Egypt and became an important leader of the pro-US, pro-West camp. And for them, the order that is breaking down now is the order that they helped bring about and build. Their number one message to the United States has been since a long time ago, that we are as good, if not even better, allies to you than Israel. So you should allow us some sort of a partnership in how you run the region, and trust us that we can protect your interests in this region. And they are very frustrated because they see that the United States has always put Israel's interest ahead of theirs, and now they're doubly frustrated because it seems that the United States has very limited power. They're busy in Afghanistan, they were busy in Iraq, they're having a confrontation with Iran, and they are trying to handle the situation in Egypt, and it seems that they are failing. They are just watching passively. So Saudi Arabia has been forced in many ways to step up as the major bulwark, the major protector of this system that is in place. So it's not surprising that it made the first statement after the following uprising in Egypt, saying this uprising, I mean, I'm talking about the early days, January 25th, this uprising is the work of foreign agents and we support the Mubarak regime. When the United States said, we might not give you the money, Saudi Arabia said, we will give you the money to the military. And not only this, we will bring an alliance that will triple the amount of aid you get from the United States as long as Mubarak stays in power. And they had, of course, let's say I'm not sure what the right word is. They did something that was not very popular, which is that they hosted Ben Ali, who ran away from Tunisia, into their soil. And jokes started spreading that they will establish a special city for all the other Arab dictators where they can retire in peace. So Saudi Arabia sees its position as not so much threatened from the inside. That internal challenge has been there for a very long time, but it's not one that they are worried about in terms of a massive popular uprising, because it's taken on some military and other forms as Al-Qaeda worked in Saudi Arabia. They're much more worried about the system of alliances in the region and the U.S. power in the region, that it seems to be falling apart.
Okay.
Well, this moment is pregnant with great opportunity for the Palestinians, not necessarily for Israel. Those in Gaza, I'm very much hopeful that Egypt will no longer cooperate with Israel in laying siege to Gaza and committing what by any criteria is a war crime. Egypt doesn't have to break its peace treaty with Israel in order not to commit a war crime, which is the siege of Gaza. So the idea of an open border and not having to get your food through a tunnel is very appealing to people in Gaza, especially also the idea of them being able to go to Egypt to study, of being able to visit their relatives there, of being able to find work there and be able to come back and move freely. This would be a major change in the life conditions of the people of Gaza if the government that comes into power will not cooperate with Israel on the siege. Of course, then Israel may start bombing on the Egyptian side of the border to destroy the tunnels on the other side. It may do all sorts of things that will test the resolve and force the military of Egypt and force perhaps the military to come back into power if it ever leaves power in order to enforce the treaty, because Israel is making threatening noises. Egypt supplies at least 40% of the natural gas to Israel under favorable conditions. The person in charge of that company and with his Israeli partner is a multi-millionaire. He ran away to the Gulf with $500 million in cash, so we heard. We don't know what will happen to that relationship exactly. There is also the issue of the newfound unity of the Egyptian people against the repressive regime being tested if Israel goes through with its threats, as they have threatened before, of stoking the fires of ethnic and religious violence in Egypt. One way, if Egypt does not follow Israel's agenda anymore, one way that Egypt can be kept busy and made powerless is to have a strong confrontation between the Coptic population and the rest of the Sunni population. There's been bombings of some churches. The former head of the Israeli intelligence bragged about how Israel has played an important role in keeping this tension alive in order to have leverage on Egypt. I would not be surprised if they resorted to that again, and this would be a destabilizing factor in the country.
Can I ask you a question on this? You say that this is, important. Could be a very radical, important change for the Palestinians and not for Israel. But there are lots of Israeli activists, pro-Palestinian Israeli activists, who actually think that this could actually be an important change for Israel as well, right? It would come in a slightly more utopian sense.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say something about this?
Well, yes. I mean, those Israelis who understand that true peace can only come about as a result of an act of justice, as opposed to militarily imposing a certain kind of peace, of course, are very much interested in having developments on the Palestinian front move towards a more just solution, so that Israel can be in a more secure place.
So that Israel would actually no longer be this proto-colonial country in the Middle East, but it would be cut down to size in a way in which it could actually coexist with other countries.
Those Israelis who stop at the issue of 1967 say the only problem is occupying 1967 lands, Gaza, and we should just return them and allow for a Palestinian state, but keep Israel what it is now, exactly as it is now. For those, yes, the idea that there could be some agreement on the settlements, there could be some agreement on Jerusalem, and there could be a Palestinian state that is more than just a fiction, would to them would be to Israel's best interest. But they represent a very, very small minority in the population. The Israeli population has been moving in a fascist direction very steadily and very quickly, especially in the last few years. And number two, that still doesn't deal with the essential issue, which is that there are the question of refugees and the question of the position of the non-Jewish citizens of Israel, 20% of the population, which also need to be dealt with, regardless of what happens in the West Bank. And so it's not something that depends entirely on Egypt, but Egypt has provided an umbrella for Israel to be able to operate with impunity vis-a-vis the Palestinians and vis-a-vis other Arab countries. That umbrella will no longer be there. I'm not saying that there'll be a dissolution of the peace treaty or any war. I don't expect that to happen at all. What I am saying is that Israel cannot count on Egypt on translating its actions into Arabic, basically, and being its proxy in the Arab world.
Thank you.